Martin Everaert from University of Utrecht.
Okay, welcome everybody. Somebody told me this morning that the title was a bit philosophical. Perhaps it is, but there will also be pictures in the PowerPoint, so it's not only deep stuff. I, for the last few years, first will tell you sort of what I'm going to do. I will make some introductory remarks, then go to the a bit philosophical question, what is language, but it will be down to earth. A few remarks about past and present, some methodological remarks which are quite necessary in this domain. Then I will discuss two approaches to language evolution, and then I will come back to the first question. For the past few years now, I have been working on language evolution as a side project. I would advise you not to work on language evolution because it's hopeless, it's endless. But it is fun. So it's when you are 60 plus, you can start working on it because nobody cares anymore what you're doing. So you can start working on peripheral stuff. This is published work. I mainly wrote. I didn't do language evolution stuff myself. I only edited volumes in which people had deep opinions about language evolution. I should start with a cautionary remark because some people misunderstand it, because the notion evolution is used in quite a broad sense. When we talk about language evolution, we talk about this. So I'm reading now what is on the on the board. It's about the processes by which the language capacity of humans first appeared in our earliest ancestor and subsequently developed in their prehistoric descendants. The changes occurred across a long succession of generations from an alingual state in which our early ancestors found themselves to what we are now. This is not language evolution. So the emergence of pigeons or simply the diachronic development of language over time, that is not what we are talking about when we are talking about language evolution. Now, this is typically a domain which is highly interdisciplinary. So people from all sorts of areas work on language evolution. Archaeologists, psychologists, geneticists, etc. And I must admit, among them, there are some linguists who also work on language evolution. Let's see whether, yeah. Most linguists, and that would include me, I say, are a bit skeptical. Skeptical in the sense we can have ideas about how language evolution proceeded, but ultimately we don't know. Ultimately, there are guesses, there are stories. Now, Herford, in a encyclopedic entry, explains that most people outside linguistics were a bit puzzled by the fact that linguists were not interested in language evolution, and he assumes that the reason for that is that most linguists are working in a structuralist mode, and I think it's appropriate in this area to mention that. I think he's wrong, but this is what he says, and because of that, he says people outside linguistics find it difficult to understand what we are doing. So he's saying, for instance, it's natural for an anthropologist to believe that at least some properties of language are the result of its use in societies. That ethologists should look for parallels between animal communication, cognition, and human language. Well, I think that over the past 20 years that has been done. For Everaert, the goal of language evolution research is to establish connections between the findings of all these areas. And I fully agree with him that that is our ultimate goal. I want to stress a little bit this point. I want to stress that in such an interdisciplinary environment, it is extremely difficult to agree on some of the basic notions. I work quite a lot with a biologist, and even the most simple notion this biologist doesn't understand or disagrees with me on what it should be. And so the notion of language for anthropologists or for biologists might be quite different from what we linguists might think. Now, this is a particular view on what language is. It is, I picked it out because it's formulated by Steven Pinker in a quite popular book. It's called The Language Instinct. And Steven Pinker writes this: language is not a cultural artifact that we learn the way we learn to tell time or how the federal government works. Instead, it is a distinct piece of the biological makeup of our brains. This is important because he is basically saying there is a biological basis to language. Language is a complex, specialized skill which develops in the child spontaneously, etc., etc., etc. Now, and he ends, for these reasons, some cognitive scientists have described language as a psychological faculty, a mental organ, a neural system, and a computational module, all quite vague terms, and he prefers the admittedly quaint term instinct. Conveys the idea that people know how to talk in more or less the sense that spiders know how to spin webs. This is a particular view on what language is. I'm giving this historical quote because I have the feeling that he had Wilhelm von Humboldt next to him when he wrote this, because it actually, when you only take this quote, it looks like von Humboldt and Steven Pinker are on one line. But it's probably wait, my thingy is going too quick. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. So now I have to be patient. Otherwise I'll do it like this. If the thing is too this was Pinker. An alternative to Pinker is Gibson. I'm quoting here Gibson from a volume that I edited with Rudy Botha, and Gibson is telling the following. There's no qualitative difference between what humans do and what animals do. Tool-making, culture, symbolism, and language are not uniquely human possessions. Modern languages, the most versatile of all animal communication systems. You see in these quotes that she is not making a difference between what we do and what our fellow animals are doing. She has a very strong position. Modern languages are just multi-purpose communication devices embedded within a multi-component communication system. Probably ancestral languages and proto-languages were as well. What for me is important that here, for Gibson, the notion communication system is central. So that is what for Gibson is what makes language is a form of a communication system. The most well developed, but not basically different from what whales or ants or bees are doing. So, and since Gibson is doing research in a particular domain, she says, great apes are our closest phylogenetic kin, a broad range of language-related cognitive, technological, social, and communicative capacities. This entire range of capacities is likely to have been inherited from the last common ancestor of great apes and humans, and hence to have set the stage for the evolution of adaptively versatile hominid species. So she sees a gradual movement from what the great apes were doing to what we are doing. Okay. I've given you the two to make clear that people can have a slightly different focus on what is crucial in language, what is essential in language, what is important in language for them. I'm not saying that Gibson is right or wrong, or that Pinker is right or wrong. I have my personal ideas, but it's basically irrelevant. I only want to make clear that the discussion becomes complicated because people are not talking about the same. And we have to, especially in an interdisciplinary environment, we have to be aware of that fact. Now, you have, if you haven't heard from language evolution, you have probably heard of this. At some point in the development of linguistics, the Société Linguistique decided that we should not talk about language evolution anymore because the stories that were told became crazier and crazier. And it is true that after nothing much happened for a very long time, and for me, the change was Hockett. By the way, a structuralist, I think. Hockett wrote, for me, a very important paper in Scientific American, and he says natural language has unique properties, among which semanticity, arbitrariness, discreteness, I'm not going to explain these notions, but he has a list of features, and he's saying, okay, these are features that natural language have, and some of the animals also have them, but by and large, these things make us different from other animals. For many people, the subsequent step in the history was a paper by Pinker and Bloom in behavioral brain sciences called Natural Language and Natural Selection. This is the story. I disagree with that story because I believe that after Hockett, the most important contribution is a contribution that is often forgotten, and it's the contribution by Eric Lenneberg. Last year was actually the 50th celebration of the publication of his book. He published the book in 1967, an extremely early example of a very important book. I'm not sure that the library has it, but if it has the book, read it. He was the first to address in a serious and informed way, the problems of talking about language evolution and language acquisition. He is basically the person who introduced the notion, critical period in language learning, into the debate. And he was not a linguist, he was a neuroscientist, psychologist. Well, we can't call him a neuroscience because that field didn't exist at that point. It is important. It's an important book, and I think that this, he died quite early. That's why his work hasn't been advertised that much. But I think it's a really important book. Much more important than Pinker and Bloom, although the Pinker and Bloom article is much more well known. Okay, so we have Lenneberg, we have Pinker and Bloom, and what about one of the most well-known linguists, of modern days, Noam Chomsky, what did he think or do? I think it's fair to say that Chomsky moved linguistics from humanities to psychology and biology, but although he moved into the direction that language evolution would be, you would consider language evolution a reasonable topic to study, he was always skeptical. So he said, this is a quote from him, there are many much simpler questions that are scarcely investigated, such as the evolution of communication in the hundreds of species of bees, because they are regarded as much too hard. So he said, why study language evolution in humans when studying the development of communication system in other species is already so difficult? And he based himself on a paper by a Lewontin biologist that he quotes quite a lot. But people change. So Chomsky, in the end, started also publishing on language evolution. But linguists, despite the skepticism in the field, started working on language evolution. And I picked out three: Ray Jackendorf, Jim Herford. I all of a sudden forgot his first name, but these are some of the publications that are all stories about how language evolved. And as I said, despite the reservation, Chomsky himself started publishing on this topic, and this paper was, in a sense, I think, important because, contrary to this paper was written together with two evolutionary biologists, Mark Hauser and Tecumseh Fitch. And because it was written together by evolutionary biologists and it published in Science, it was perhaps taken more seriously than other stories. And it triggered the whole discussion. Now, before I'm going to give you two of those stories, I want to highlight something that Rudy Botha, in a book called Language Evolution, a Windows Approach, highlighted in 2016. And he says, well, okay, it's fine to do language evolution, but you researchers, you have to be quite clear on what you are doing. So we know that there is no material, there is no written thing that tells us when language existed, when it emerged. So we have to rely on other stuff. So we only have indirect evidence. There is no direct evidence. And from that indirect evidence, we have to decide on what that might tell us about the use of language. And he calls that the Windows approach. So he says, you take a phenomenon, and that phenomenon tells you something about language indirectly. So you have this formulation. The phenomenon X is considered to be a window on a distinct phenomenon Y. If looking at X makes it possible to see something of Y. And I'll give you a few examples. I'll skip this. So I'll give you an example. This is Blombos Cave. Rudy Botha works in South Africa, so he was very close to when this happened. The cave on this picture below is Blombos Cave, South Africa. It's famous because it was found to contain some of the oldest traces of human imagination. Yeah? I'm using the imagination. Others will say symbolic behavior. whatever you use, imagination or symbolic behavior, it's extremely difficult to define what you actually mean, what symbolic behavior is. This is actually a definition that I borrowed from Erik Roland, my colleague. Imagination, in a most modern sense, results of imagination freed from the use in the direct struggle for life with the natural environment. As an illustration, the next slide shows you perhaps a product of imagination. So we are talking about something that we can date to 70,000 years before present. There are pieces of ochre with engravings. These engravings are considered symbolic behavior. And we have these beads. Now you see that these beads are also here turned into a necklace. The necklace they didn't find, they only found the beads. Yeah? And getting these beads, when Henshelwood found these beads, he said the following. Because I found these beads, and here are the inferential steps that he's taking. From data about certain properties of the marine shells, it is inferred that these shells were worn as beads by humans some 75,000 years ago. So you see shells, but the shells have holes in it. So the assumption is that it's not simply shells, but deliberately with a hole so that they were used as beads. From the assumption that these beads, it is inferred that these humans engaged in symbolic behavior. So if you are struggling to survive, why on earth would you make a necklace of beads? Yeah. So the creature doing this was giving some sort of a symbolic behavior. From assumption about the symbolic behavior of these humans, it is inferred that they had fully syntactical language. Now this last step, and that is the step that Henshelwood is taking, is quite a big step. But he's basically saying, if there is a creature who is capable of doing this, then that creature must have language. Same with this. We see here a shell, actually in the possession of a museum in the Netherlands, and there are etchings visible. It's very difficult, but they have studied the etchings, and they are not random, they are deliberately. So again, the assumption was this is rudimentary symbol behavior. Why on earth would a creature, in this particular case, much earlier, so 500,000 years ago, why would such a creature carve into a shell these forms? Now, in the science publication, or it was Nature, I forget, nobody says anything about symbolic behavior or language, but in more popular publications in Scientific American, the suggestion is made, if this creature, 500,000 years, could etch on these shells, that must have been a creature who might have had language. So here's another example, another type of window approach. Bickerton is saying, I know a lot about pidgin languages, and my assumption is that what is happening in pidgin language also happened a very long time ago in something that he called proto-language. I have to look at the time. Yeah, I'm still sort of okay. So I will not dwell too much on Bickerton. So the Windows approach says it's perfectly fine. I accept that we have to make statements from outside language to say something about language, but please be explicit on the inferential steps you make. And I think that really is completely right. Okay. Now, this is the general problem, and now I'm stepping to two approaches. one within the context of biolinguistics, another one by Corvallis. Now, biolinguistics is a recent field of linguists who consider the biological basis of language very important, and that's why they have started this notion of biolinguistics, although it's actually a quite old notion because Lenneberg was basically already using it. Whether or not that is useful, let's not talk about that. I don't think it's extremely useful, but in the context of this approach, Everaert and Noam Chomsky wrote a book, Why Only Us, where they explained how they would look at language evolution. Now, this is basically a repetition of their position, which is already also explained in the Steven Pinker approach. The language faculty is a module of the organism. There is a biological basis to language. Now, for them, it's important that language emerged suddenly. Yeah? So they say it's the appearance of a qualitatively different phenomenon at a specific stage of organizational complexity. The assumption is that the change from alingual to lingual is quite fast, quite quick. Let's say 30, 40, 50 generations. I don't know. I mean, the whole concept is it's not gradual, like Gibson is saying, but it's quite quick. And I later on will explain why they need to take that position. Now, they can talk about that as quick because they believe that there is one element of language that is crucial, essential, and it is imaginable, and Everaert and Chomsky show that in their book. It's quite imaginable that such a small genetic change might have created this, the basic property, what he calls nowadays the basic property merge, and what he earlier called recursion. Assuming that recursion is an essential part of language, that language is of course much more than that, but that recursion is a very central thing, and that once you have recursion, you basically can develop language in a more well-known way as we know languages. Yeah? He nowadays talks about this basic property, which is the concept that we have a system making infinite use of finite means. So that these are rewrite rules. If you don't know rewrite rules, forget about them. But with these two small rules, you could create the possible utterance, not likely in actual life, the aunt of my father, of the niece, of the neighbor, of the wife, of the brother. You could continue. In actual fact, you will not continue, but Chomsky says that principle of unboundedness, the possibility of unboundedness, I take as the central aspect of language. So in order to make that clear, I think that Chomsky made a very useful distinction between faculty of language in the narrow sense and the faculty of language in the broad sense. It's useful in order to understand what he is talking about. It is not necessarily useful for other linguists. But he's saying, okay, there is the faculty of language in the narrow sense, and when we talk about the evolution of language, we are talking about having this, the faculty of language in the narrow sense, the ability to compute units into larger units. So the structural aspect of language, that is what the faculty of language in the narrow sense is. And then we have the faculty of language in the broad sense. All other factors, cognitive, biological, anatomical, whatever, that contribute to the acquisition and use of language. So Chomsky is not denying that the language we speak, English or whatever, is more than this, but he wants to make this distinction between the two. And he, in the House of Chomsky and Fitch paper, they have this picture and that tries to explain it. So here we have something that is unique to humans. So this is the only thing that is unique to humans, and which is called recursion. By the way, the notion of recursion is quite problematic, but for the moment, let's skip that. And he says there is, of course, there are other aspects to language, which we could call language, but it is important that in almost all cases, these aspects have been shown to be shared by other species. So, for instance, theory of mind, it's not unique to humans. Other species also have theory of mind. Some are very good at imitation, others are not good at imitation. So there is a lot that we share with other species, but only this is something that we don't share with other species. Now, Corvallis is quite a different kettle of fish, so to say. I've taken this from a Trends in Cognitive Science paper from last year or the year before that, I don't know. And in that paper, he explains that he wants to adhere to a Darwinian view on evolution, so gradual. So he basically argues explicitly against this idea that evolution would be in one swoop, what they call saltation. So he believes in a gradual growth of language. He does admit that evolutionary theory nowadays is not only about this adaptive behavior, that there is more, and that there are some changes that lead to quite drastic changes in evolution, but still he believes that the whole story of language evolution better fits this Darwinian approach. And he quotes the fact that Pinker and Bloom also discuss a number of these Darwinian possibilities. There is every reason to believe that language has been shaped by natural selection as it is understood within the orthodox synthetic or neo-Darwinian theory of evolution. So this is the opposition. It's not only the opposition between linguists and non-linguists, because Pinker is, well, no, Pinker is not a linguist, it's true, he's a psychologist, but still. You can call him a generative grammarian, so. But he believes in a Darwinian approach, step by step. And this is also important for Corvallis, because he thinks that this mental continuity is important. And again, looking at the time, he takes this, what he calls mental time travel, as crucial. He thinks that the concept of mental time travel not only appears in humans but also in other species, that mental time travel is the crucial factor which we share with other species, but somehow we have developed it into something more elaborate than scrubbiers or rats or chimpanzees. Read the paper and he will explain it better than I'm doing now. And there is a reason for this mental time travel, because he can neuroscientifically relate it to the hippocampus, and that might also be relevant for language. So there is a neuroscientific glitch to this whole story of Corvallis. So for him, spatial imagination, the possibility to move is in mental time is for him crucial. It's a crucial feature and is the basis of language. Yeah? And he believes that this aspect also basically gives you recursion. So it seems as he all sort of accepts that recursion is a notion that you need to address. But he takes the quite sudden approach that Berwick and Chomsky take, goes contrary to that. So there are choices to be made, and to make explicit, that's why I had this in the title, language. What is language? Not that we can really answer what language is, but there are certain features which you could consider central or non-central, or very important or peripheral. And I'm giving you some of the choices that Chomsky is making, and you by. Okay. So let's take this. Language, in essence, is not a cultural tool. That is already there in the quote by Steven Pinker. But, for instance, somebody like Daniel Everaert takes this contra disposition. For him, language is very much embedded in culture, so you should not separate language from culture. That is the wrong decision. For Chomsky, language is not a system of communication. Again, it's perhaps quite problematic to assume that, but for Chomsky, language is primarily a system for thought. Speech is a derived feature. Communicating with others is important in real life, but is not the feature that defines language for him. It's a bit black and white. Language is primarily a system for thought. Speech is a derived feature. I will explain that in the following slide. Speech is derived because the assumption is that there is language with a capital L, and then there is this manifestation of language. And the language can be manifested in spoken language, as we normally do, but language can also go through signs or the haptic system. Actually, the wife of Noam Chomsky worked on that, people communicating through the haptic system, but never finished her research, as far as I know. But you all have heard about sign languages, which we take proper languages. So it is important to understand that speech is there, of course, it's a very influential feature, but it's not essential. Yeah? So we can do without speech. I think that everybody agrees that language is closely intertwined with nonverbal modes of communication, such as gestures, eye contact. At least I would be happy to admit that language is closely intertwined with communication, communicative behavior, and that quite a lot of language features could be explained as the result of this communicative behavior, but again, it cannot explain all. At least that is the position that Chomsky takes. So the language communicative function does not underpin the essential properties of language. And this is from a quote. Just read it, and you see that this is a story he repeats quite often. Yes, we use language a lot, but the question is whether that is what we do most, communicating with language, or whether communication with language is actually a byproduct of thought. And a lot of communicative behavior is actually not about communication, depending on how you define communication, of course. Okay? So once you have seen these choices, I'm almost finished, I guess. Once you have seen these choices, you now understand, I will try to explain to you that the position by Jekyll and Steven Pinker is untenable for him. Ray Jekyll and Steven Pinker say individuals endowed with a more highly developed language faculty had some adaptive advantage over those with a less highly developed one. So natural selection played a role in each step. However, if you take that route, you have to assume that that adaptive advantage is more communicative power. And given the fact that Chomsky doesn't accept that, he can't take this route. He can't take this adaptive behavior, so he will opt for this saltational view that first there is something that gives huge adaptive power, and then it's externalized as language. He talks about design principles. I also like to talk about design principles, basically referring back to the paper by Hockett. For Chomsky, the rapid phenotypic change is easier to handle if change is not triggered by communicative empowerment. Then this is the option that you could take, and this is what Chomsky is taking. Again, I'm not saying that he's right. I personally am prepared to believe his story, but for today, I only want to get across is that you have to take certain decisions on what you think that is important, and once you have taken those decisions, you can see which data are relevant for your story about language evolution. So my position would be that humans have language in this narrow, very narrow sense, that animals don't. However, at the same time, I realize that many aspects of language we might share with other animals, although they might lack the full range we have access to. So it could be that we are the best of all worlds, that we pick all the relevant communicative stuff that other animals have in isolation and combine that into what we now call language. A cautionary wrote that the story that I'm telling about biolinguistics is you can't even call it a minority view. I mean, when Bob Burke is seeing this video, he will kill me, but it's peripheral. This biolinguistic view on language evolution, the story that I told you about in Why Only Us, is accepted by very few people. That doesn't mean that they are not right, but it's accepted by very few people, including many generative grammarians who don't believe that that is the right way to look at it. My last important in this debate is that anyone should be explicit on what exactly language is, so that anyone can claim that animals do or don't have language. That's it.
Still have 5 or 10 minutes for questions.
Does anyone dare to ask a question? Yeah.
I'm just wondering, Cedric Beck's, one of those beside you, now you're also interested in biolinguistics, I understand, right? So this is probably a very good actually meeting ground with others working on language evolution from the point of view of culture, or the symbolic culture. And then probably, this is what Cedric Beck actually says with a paper with Deleuze, I can't remember, it's a Greek name. Now, so he quotes a number of grammarians, including Lamarck and others, the cognitive grammarians, and he says essentially it's high time that actually the call on generative and minimalist the view be somehow geared into this common view which Well, and then we should actually inform each other of many interesting aspects. And from what you're saying, is that you seem to be sympathetic, right? I mean, to this view.
Yeah, is this still recorded? Yeah? Okay, then I'll give my political answer. But later on I will tell you what I've actually No. This is not only political, this is true. Yes, any discussion is hampered if you are not prepared to read what other people have written on the subject. So I try in my own classes to not hide that I'm not a Tomasello fan, but I'm still giving my students what Tomasello thinks and tell them he may be right. I think he's wrong, but he may be right. We can disagree or think about it. And I think that Virginia Valian is doing quite good work in bringing the fields together so that we can talk. So also in this domain, I think it's wise not to exclude what others say and say, no, he is from a different camp, so let's not read. Actually, when working on this talk, I realized that Chomsky's view on this one swoop is about the faculty of the language in a narrow sense. Yeah? And then he assumes that, okay, then we had a creature that had thought in his or her head, but didn't externalize it or limit it. But later on it was externalized because we developed actual language. So in the development of the faculty of the language in the broad sense, all these communicative power must have played a role, I think. So there is a part of the story that is not about communication, but I think that the other part is about communication. And I'm perfectly happy to go along that route as long as people don't say stuff like this language is more complex than the other language and stuff like that, which I get the creeps. I mean, the idea that Creoles are lesser languages than Hungarian or Slovak or Polish. Or that Russian, what is better, Russian or Polish? My teacher of German always said, well, you start out with English, that you are doing here. Don't take notice of that. Dutch is a little bit better, but you have to move to German, the language of the philosophers and the real poets, etc. So
that's even worse now because you're moving into the animals' language.
Yeah, maybe the animal languages are much more effective than what we are doing. I don't know whether they have any rising principles. I don't know whether we ever studied whether chimpanzees or finches applied the rising principles.
Okay, thank you very much, Martin, for your lecture. Time for break. We continue at 4. Yeah?